Um, in that context, I've spent a lot of time with parents in the age range that you are in terms of raising children. And so, I'm not an expert on parenting, but I've seen a lot of parents, and I can tell already that despite the challenges of the pandemic, you remind me of this quote from Fred Rogers: the greatest gift you ever give is your honest self. And I think that's important when your honest self is loving the moments that happen, as well as when your honest self isn't loving the moments that happen. Um, I want to acknowledge to begin with that parenting is an enormous challenge, even if you have only one child, but certainly even more when you have multiple children and you're working on parenting while you're pregnant, which is the case for many of you at the moment. Also, the toddler years are particularly difficult years because in some ways they're ready for so much, and in other ways they're really just not. And my favorite image of this is here. And the most important thing about seeing these two faces is to notice that they are mere milliseconds apart. If you look at the timestamps, one is 10:02:09 and one is 10:02:23. And that's about how quickly emotions can go from one extreme to the other in normal times. And we're in the middle of a pandemic where you have all kinds of different stresses on the family in general, but also you have the isolation that you've been living with for the past year. And while there is certainly light at the end of the tunnel, we have to remember that there are still all kinds of risks that we have to think about that add stresses. So I want to start out by encouraging you to remember to take the long view. We're going to have days that are challenging. We're going to have moments, like you mentioned, that are beautiful and wonderful. And those are the moments that we can hold on to. But when we're making decisions about how to parent, we want to think about that longer view because that's what you're aiming for. You also want to remember, and especially because we have people here from so many different backgrounds, you're living in different places in different contexts. There are lots and lots of ways to succeed in parenting. So it's not like there's one answer. Like when I teach child development, I teach traditional undergraduates, very few of whom have children, some of whom maybe have younger siblings that, they were old enough to notice as they were being raised. But a lot of them at Carnegie Mellon are engineers and computer science students, and they just want me to give them a formula like they have in their other classes. And it's just child development just isn't that way. And so we have to remember that as we go through the process. Lots and lots of things can work. And so I'll try to give you some ideas about things to think about, but there isn't exactly one answer. And then I also just want to remind you that every day is a fresh start. And there are very, very few things that we can do that would cause a problem that has long-term consequences. So remember, if you don't have one of those good days, then start fresh the next day. That's really okay. That's how it works. We're all going to have days. I forget who it was that mentioned, like, usually I lose, I have a short fuse, but today I was able to be patient. Great. Congratulate yourself about that. Not every day is going to be that way, and that's okay. The children will be fine. So there are a couple of concepts from child development that I thought it would help us to consider before I turn to some of the questions that came in on the surveys. And I'll acknowledge that not everyone who turned in those questions is actually here, but I don't necessarily know who submitted which ones. So I will try to answer also any other questions that you want to put in the chat. And Ariel, you should feel free to interrupt me if something comes in the chat that you want me to stop and address at the moment. But I'd say for the last definitely decade and maybe a little bit longer, psychologists have been focusing on the importance of executive function And, a lot of times we think about they need to learn to talk, they need to learn to write, they need to learn to read, all those kind of things. But the most important skills are sort of the self-management skills. We think of executives like in business, but essentially these are the parts of our brain and the strategies and skills that we use to manage ourselves so that we can achieve our goals, so that we can live well and learn well. And there really are three of them. I've got some definitions here, and then I'm going to show you a quick video that explains these functions. But basically, we have to manage the information in our minds. And, it's really not until close to 3 that children really understand that they have a memory and that they can talk about memories. Actually, I think Ariel's daughter, Violet, who's just a little over 3, she texted us recently that Violet had said, remember when da, 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 da had happened. The fact that she could say that means that she actually realizes she has the memory and that she can call up things, and you can talk about memories just like you can talk about objects. But until children are about 3, they don't really understand that. And so just even remembering what the directions were is a big part of being able to follow directions, which we would love toddlers to do better, but there's some parts of it that are really difficult for them. And then there's the self-control. Even if you remember what someone wants you to do, you have to have the self-control to stop whatever impulse you have and do the thing that they want you to do. And those of you who have toddlers, and certainly if your children are older, you've been through this phase where they really just want to keep doing what they want to do. And it's very hard for them to shift their attention by controlling their behavior and shifting it to something else. And that leads us to the mental flexibility. Through all of this, you have to be able to change gears. You have to be able to be flexible. And as adults, we have a lot more strategies for doing that. We can talk to ourselves, give ourselves some strategies, pep ourselves up, those kinds of things. But young children, it's very difficult for them to have those skills. So let me pause this sharing for a moment and show you a quick video that will give you an idea of these executive function skills with respect to actual children. And those of you who have older children, this actually does show how those skills really matter for when children are starting into school, or whether you're homeschooling, it doesn't really matter. The point is the same.
Science tells us that brains, minds, are built, not born. And at the center of this dynamic architecture are a set of skills called executive function and self-regulation.
Children's self-regulation and executive function are key ingredients in their lifetime performance. It's not just about learning language or learning numbers or learning colors. We have to be able to work effectively with others, with distractions, with multiple demands. These actually are skills that contribute to the productivity of the American workforce.
Look at your shapes. What should you have done next?
Educators, I think, are looking for just this sort of thing. And when we describe what we mean by executive function, they say, yes, that's it. That's exactly, the problem. These kids, they can tell me these rules, but they can't actually use them.
What's this?
A toolbox.
A tool.
What is executive function?
Safety goggles. Probably the best way to think about it is sort of like an air traffic control system in the brain. Just like an air traffic control system has to manage lots of airplanes going on lots of runways and really exquisite timing and so on. A child has to manage a lot of information and avoid distractions. We really think of it as involving working memory and inhibitory control and mental flexibility. Take a situation where a child is having to take turns. So first of all, the child has to have
inhibitory control. The child has to be able to stop whatever he or she is doing and let the other child take a turn. But when it's your turn again, you also have to remember what it is you're supposed to be doing. So that pulls on working memory. If the children who are taking the turns after you do something unpredictable, you have to be able to adjust what you're going to do next. And that requires mental flexibility. Children who are struggling with these capacities often look like children who just aren't paying attention, or children who are deliberately not controlling themselves.
If you don't have self-regulation, you act out and the teacher puts you in timeout, and so then you miss part of the learning that's going on, and then you are more upset because you're behind, and so you act out, and so you get this downward spiral.
How does executive function develop?
7 and plus 4.
In little children, and even in the infant and toddler years, you begin to see the roots of executive functioning skills. What's going on in our brains is unbelievably intricate and complicated. The prefrontal cortex, or the front third of the brain, is important for executive function. But it's more than just prefrontal cortex. This region doesn't act alone. It's involved in controlling your behavior through its interactions with all other parts of the brain. The brain goes from a situation where you've got nearest neurons communicating very strongly with each other and ignoring the rest of the brain, to these widespread networks that are connecting these different areas. Executive function changes over the life course. It improves radically over the first few years.
I got a match drive.
It continues to improve throughout adolescence. It's not until early adulthood that you have the adult type networks that are very strongly activated that connect different brain regions together.
Let's take notes.
Also, we believe that executive functions can be trained.
It's just like going to the gym. So the more you practice in these areas, the stronger the capacity is likely to become, because you're hoping to strengthen those neural connections.
Mom, you're at 24.
Slowly but surely, you're going to be able to step back, and that child's going to go into the world with these skills where they can get along with other people, change rules, and they can be flexible, and they can accomplish new things, and they're unafraid.
I got bit by my dog in my arm. Oh dear.
If we don't learn these skills during the childhood and adolescent years when they're coming online, we are really ill-equipped as an adult to hold a job, to maintain a marriage, to raise children, to get along with each other, to basically be part of a civil society.
You're okay.
So I'm going to switch videos. If there's anyone that has a question, feel free to put it in the chat. I wanted to show you one thing that's a little bit more for your children's age. So this video is showing the difference between 14 months and 18 months. And I know some of you said you have 18-month-olds. You may have just seen this transition in terms of understanding other people's minds.
The question of how early children start to understand that other people think differently than they do is at the heart of a series of experiments conducted by Alison Gopnik of the University of California at Berkeley and her colleagues. In one study, 14 and 18-month-old children come into the lab and are presented 2 bowls, one with broccoli in it and one with crackers. Dr. Gopnik takes a taste of each of the foods.
Oh, yuck! I touched the crackers. I don't like crackers. Ooh.
Broccoli. I like broccoli.
She clearly prefers the broccoli. To see if the child understands what she prefers, Dr. Gopnik puts out her hand and asks, Could you give me some? Give me what I like.
But
What we discovered was that 18-month-olds would give me the broccoli if I acted as if I liked the broccoli, even though they probably prefer the crackers themselves. So even these very, very little children already seem to have realized, okay, this is the strange person, she likes broccoli, but if that's what she likes, then that's what I'm going to give her. And that's a really amazing thing for children this young to know.
Thank you.
The 14-month-olds were not like that. The 14-month-olds would just always give me the crackers, whether I liked the crackers or the broccoli.
Could you give me some and then I'll have some? Oh, thank you.
So even children that are very, very young are able to think about what other people like. And that means that what happens when you're working with your toddlers is that they're very clear about what makes you happy and what doesn't make you happy, what gets your attention and what doesn't get your attention. Yet they don't have all of those executive function skills that are going to allow them to keep things in mind, to control their impulses, and to flexibly shift. Okay, so you're going to see that coming back when we talk about the issues that you raised as challenging, and I'll try to bring it back to executive function. Now, another key concept, actually one pause, we had planned for you to have a couple of resources that we will give you, but they got mailed to me instead of getting mailed to Ariel. But the community playthings community, a Bruderhof community, has provided pamphlets for you. They're sort of little booklets, one on the wisdom of play and one on the wisdom of nature. And interestingly, a lot of the moments that you mentioned when I asked about the positive moments today or this week have to do with children's sort of free play and children's experiences in nature. And it turns out that both of those are really good opportunities for building these executive function skills. So I'm going to be seeing Ariel in a couple of weeks, and I'll bring those booklets for you. And she's going to arrange that together with some other resources she has to provide, you could pick up at the Athens Library, and they'll be free to you. I also have created a Google folder where there are a lot of different articles that you might use. And later when I switch back in, have access to the chat, I'll put the link to that. Very short articles that relate to all of the different topics that we're going to talk about today, and some of which are specific to questions you asked. One of the parents who has among the youngest children's specifically asked, I would just like to see some checklists, like what should I be working on for my child at different ages. And so there's a document there that talks about, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months and onward, what kinds of things are developing naturally and what you can do as a parent to help with those kinds of things. So the other key concept from developmental psychology that I hope that you'll think about is what's technically called the zone of proximal development, proximal meaning near. An easier way to think about it is to think about it like the Goldilocks principle. So you probably know the Goldilocks story. And in her experience, things that are of the papas are too, in this case, too hot. The mama's too cold. The baby bears are just right. Or the bed is too hard. The bed is too soft. The bed is just right. It's the exact same principle with your child. So what you're trying to do as a parent is figure out how can you get to that exact Goldilocks, just right kind of experience for your child. And so you want to think about trying to aim for what's called the learning zone. You want to stretch out of the comfort zone. If you only ever do things that are in your comfort zone, you don't grow very much, or you certainly don't grow to your maximum potential. But if you're constantly given challenges that are above the possibility, here it says what the student cannot do even with assistance, then you're in the anxiety zone. You're just constantly creating more anxiety, truthfully, for the child and for yourself. So you want to aim for that zone in the middle, where it's a stretch, but with assistance, the child can reach that next level. That's what'll aim for maximal growth. So no matter whether we're trying to teach social skills or emotion regulation, any of these things, we want to try to keep children right in that learning zone. So a lot of different toddler challenges were mentioned in the surveys that I got. And interestingly, some of them are essentially opposite. And that brings up the principle that every advance in development brings a new challenge. Easy ones to think about are, when your child learns to crawl or learns to walk, that's great, but now they can get into a lot more, and it's actually riskier in a way. So it's an accomplishment, but it's riskier. Children learn to talk, and we're like thrilled for them, but then sometimes it's hard to keep them from talking. They're always talking. So here, the two challenges that got raised, one was, my child isn't talking very much. How do I interpret my child's needs and essentially help my child to use his words? On the other hand, some people said, I'm having trouble dealing with my child who's so argumentative, right? So learn to use the words, knows exactly what you like and what you don't like, but is now using them not constructively. And in fact, this mom who wrote this one said that her child has started swearing, not just at her, but at other people when they're out in the community. And so, yes, there's an advance in talking, but now we have to help the child know sort of what's appropriate for talking and what's not. And if we think about that in terms of executive functions, then we have to think about, okay, well, there are some rules that we need the child to remember, like, we need to treat people respectfully, and that's not a respectful way to talk. To control that, when you feel like saying that, what else can you say instead? And to begin to have that flexibility to shift. And so that's on the end of the child who is talking. The child who's not talking, there are many strategies that we can use to scaffold. So we can give the child pictures, we can teach the child some basic sign language. Children can almost always do sign language before they can speak certain words. So that can be helpful. And so we want to figure out, how can we address each of those situations? Now I see there's a question in the chat. Let's see. So self-control is sort of what we're talking about. Sally is quick to go to the anger, violence when he doesn't get his way at home. Also resists attempts I've made to talk about his feelings and debrief. Yeah, that's a challenging one. And I think you said Sally's around 3 or 4. Somebody remind me.
Yeah, that's.
I've seen Sally on Zoom, but so he's in the 3 to 4 range.
Oh, that's great. He's 4. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you. This is Bridget, right? Yeah. So
yeah, it is.
Right. So somebody else mentioned the breathing strategies, and that's a good one, but some children sort of get past that, in a sense that they're like, I don't want to breathe. They know that it will help them, but they don't want to do that. And so I think that the key for this kind of situation, and I have a later slide that's also about the tantrums, because that's another big one, is that we have to work before things are happening. In the moment, the emotions are too high for any kind of reasoning. Like the talking about the feelings and debriefing, you can't do it when the emotions are high. You can only do it when the emotions are low, because that changes your learning zone, right? You know it yourself. All of us know we're not at our best when we're tired, hungry, not feeling well. Those of you who are pregnant know, different times you're feeling differently. We don't do our best. And so where children will do better with that kind of talking about feelings and debriefing is at separate times, and also when it's external. So that's where we read a lot of stories. We read stories about emotions, so they start to have the words for them. We read stories about what do you do when you just feel so mad, like a Fred Rogers, what do I do with the mad I feel? When I feel so mad, I can hit, I think it is, or I punch, something like that. Those things have to sort of come separately. And the anger violence piece, that's when we need to really help the child stay safe, because we don't want them to be hitting their siblings or friends, those kinds of things. But at the same time, they may need a separate space to be able to calm down. You have to get a little bit of sense for an individual child. Some children, they really love to be hugged. They really love that, what psychologists would call deep pressure. Some children, that actually makes it worse. They need to be on their own and kick it out, work it out, whatever. So you kind of have to know a little bit for your own child. Now, I don't know if you want to go deeper with this, if you have some things that you've tried or that you've seen have worked better than others, or others that have older children might also have suggestions. Anyone want to chime in?
That's great. I appreciate that thought. And I can certainly see where that attentiveness to what's going on in the moment and being willing to sort of drop what I'm doing in order to manage it before it escalates, maybe could be given more priority if I want it to go a different way.
Right.
Yeah, I like that. And I think, one of the things I'll take away is trying to normalize his emotions and try to give him tools through, like, exposing him to books or sort of talking about it outside of the immediate situation where it went awry. Because he does feel really ashamed whenever he doesn't want to talk about it if it's a mistake that he thinks he made. He really doesn't want to go there.
Right. And
even if we're telling him everybody makes mistakes.
Right. But that's actually a great time to say, oh, remember what this child did or this character did in the book? Because again, if they can externalize it, it's not really about them. So that takes away a little bit of that emotion of the potentially like shame or something like that. And it also gives them a clue what to do. It's not a big, talk about it for a long time because you talked about it when you read the book, but just reminding them like, oh, I'm going to think of some of the characters of the books that I've read with Lucia and Violet, but like, well, what would the Princess in Black do? Or something like that kind of it almost also diffuses it because it gets them out of the current situation and puts them into this imaginary situation. That can sometimes work. Now, I don't know if the person who asked about the swearing is here, but one thing about swearing is that children are learning at this time that words have power, and we do want them to use their words. Mostly, they see the big reaction that the words get when they are words we don't want them to use. And so that actually can fuel it. They can actually, they know how to push your buttons, right? So they know that, oh, that's a button that pushes mom. Let me try that and see if I can get what I want. So the lower key reaction that you can have, the better off you'll be. In no uncertain terms, you want to tell them, these are not appropriate words, but super calm. These are not appropriate words. We're not, like, I'm not responding to that. This is not an appropriate way to handle the situation. End of story, and move on. And when they learn that those words actually aren't going to get them what they want, then they'll typically stop doing it. It's the same thing that happens with bathroom words when children get to preschool. It's the same thing that happens with lying when children get to be about 5. They learn more things about how their words can be used, and we just have to show them what the boundaries are so they know not to go outside of those boundaries, but in a super calm kind of way. So another challenge relates to some of these executive functions. One person asked how to help the toddler be a better listener and not have attention span problems. But somebody else asked how to deal with toddler willfulness, which actually means they're paying a lot of attention. They know exactly what they want to do, and it's not what you want them to do. So yes, we want them to have better attention, but we also want them to have that mental flexibility that we can get them to do what we need them to do. So with the first side, the better listener side, let's just remember how old they are and what they actually can remember, what is going to catch their attention. So if your children have been in any kind of programs with multiple children, you probably know that teachers of young children use songs for everything. It's because the songs are more memorable, right? You've got the tune, you've got the rhythm, and you've got the words. So it's easier for children to remember. And so for children who need help with that, that's a direction to go. Anything with a rhyme, a rhythm, a song, those kinds of things will help. It also helps with attention, but also remember that children, there's a certain limit by their age. So let's not expect them to be paying attention for 20 minutes. That's why when you go to the library, the story times are short. And if you have story times for different age children, it can get longer and longer. And your goal is to gradually lengthen. And again, in that learning zone, just a little longer the next time, just a little bit longer. But realize, some children, if you get 2 minutes, that's awesome for them. And then just keep working up from there. In terms of the willfulness and doing what's asked, I think it's really important for children to be preset for the kinds of things that we want them to do. And often the challenge is that we're in a rush, but they don't understand the rush. And so that's where we can get to a problem. And so if we can sort of back things up and think more ahead about, well, what is it that we need them to do and by when and why, we can help them get there. And usually it means we have to be a little more organized, we have to be more ready. But remember, they don't have the understanding of the situation to sort of rush themselves. They don't have the self-control to break away from that favorite thing they're doing, because you need them to put their shoes on and get out the door. And so it's not exactly that they don't want to do what you want to do. We interpret it that way, but usually it's just they're really happy doing what they want. And getting into the car seat is probably not their biggest priority. This is when a strategy called first then often works, where you can think about, well, what is something they do like about what's going to happen? Like once we get in the car, maybe they really like a certain CD or something like that. So I need you to get your shoes on now, and then, first get your shoes on, and then we get in the car and you can listen to the CD, something like that. So kind of think about for them, in their point of view, what is the win of doing what you want them to do, but also preset them. Give them a 5 minutes, in 5 minutes, it's going to be time to stop this. And then maybe a 1 minute warning or something like that. Because they just can't manage that themselves. You've got to scaffold that for them so that they're in the right learning zone. And again, I don't know if the people who raise these questions are actually here, but if you want to go deeper on any of them, feel free to put something in the chat and we will. So overall, in terms of parenting, I just want to mention a couple of key things that could apply to any situation that you might have. One is, you think of yourself as both a mentor and a model, because children are watching you. And so a lot of times we don't actually externalize what it is we're thinking and doing. So wow, tomorrow's going to be a busy morning, so I'm going to get my things out the night before and blah, 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 like whatever you're doing. We don't typically externalize that or verbalize that for children, but it can really help them and encouraging them to participate. So I know you're going to be tired in the morning when we have to get ready to go. So let's pick your clothes now, and let them be a part of that process. So you're sort of modeling it for yourself, but also mentoring them. And when it comes to issues of risky behavior, like you don't want them to climb on things or whatever, you can also sort of model that kind of thinking. Like, oh, this seems like a place where it's going to be important for me to stay with my parents. Somebody mentioned about the child running away from them in a store or things like that. Obviously we have to monitor them, but at the same time, like preset them for that, this is a place where as long as you can see me, it's free, you're free to go, you're free to run. But now we're in the grocery store. This is a place where I need you to be able to stay right with me. do you want to hold my hand or could I put you in the cart or whatever? Let them have some choice, but make sure it's really clear boundaries so that you're monitoring. Obviously, that would be too risky. With the pandemic, there have been a lot of situations like that, where we could even not do things that we used to be able to do. Also, you also always want to balance the warmth and the structure. So it's sort of like being both kind and firm. Children actually feel better. It's more secure when there are clear boundaries. Having few boundaries actually causes more anxiety for the child, especially if they're changing. They don't know what it's going to be at a given time. So when you think about discipline, think about it as boundary setting. And yes, you can choose within these limits. And, our rule is that the limits are what's respectful, what's safe, whatever, depends on the situation. What you don't want to do is just say no to things, either because I said so, which is like an authoritarian, like a dictator kind of approach, or you don't want it to be, you can do whatever you want, because in many situations, you can't just do whatever you want. So helping the children understand what are the limits for the particular situation is really, really important. So I saw a chat pop up. Let's see what it is. Would you say the if-then approach is the best approach? Oh, regardless of age. So I think this, so you have children from ages 2 through 7 staying on task, taking the step we tell them to, like putting on their shoes without getting distracted. So the if-then can work, but your 9-year-old, there's sort of a boundary around 8 where, they were talking about the executive function. There's actually a brain rewiring that happens around age 8. And so children around that time are better able to manage themselves and maybe would respond well to helping one of the younger children. So that 9-year-old really shouldn't need that, because that should be able to be managed by themselves. And oftentimes, if they're struggling and you sort of deputize them, they become your deputy to help one of the younger children, maybe not the youngest one, but maybe the next one in line. That can actually be a help for that child because it gives them more responsibility. So I think you're right that there are some differences. There are 3 main brain rewirings, one at 5, which is what helps you to start to see that people don't know what you know. Also ends up helping you realize that lying can actually work, but also helps you get better at making surprises, right? Keeping a secret so that you can surprise someone. Then there's the one around 8 that gives you more of this executive function. And then there's another one around 13, which nobody has children quite then, but that's what gets you to more abstract thinking and closer to adult thinking. So yeah, thanks for that question. Okay, so oh, actually, and another point that's a word maybe not to use is a lot of times we tell children, go ahead and put on your shoes, okay? Well, once you've said okay, that's almost making it a question. Like, you might not have to. We do it often because it sounds nicer, but it's actually can backfire because it makes it sound like it's a choice. So really, it's just better to say, it's time to put on your shoes now, then we're going to do this or whatever, and drop the okay. Listen to yourself. I bet you'll hear yourself saying it pretty frequently. So a lot of you asked about issues that relate to toddler discipline, and in particular, children who end up throwing a massive fit, won't comply, it turns into a huge tantrum. So here again, once children have started that escalation, I think Bridget just mentioned the escalation thing, you really can't think that they're going to be able to like calm themselves, that they're going to be able to have that mental flexibility. You sort of past the point of no return. So you're best off if you can head it off in the pass. But if you can't head it off in the pass, one thing that makes tantrums keep going is that the children basically start mixing. They know they shouldn't be doing this, they actually start feeling badly about doing it, but they can't get out of it. So that actually makes it worse. It makes it spiral negative. So if your child is one who can take the hugging, the best thing is actually to be able to comfort them. Like, I know you're so upset right now. I'm here with you. I'll help you get through it. Some children, on the other hand, cannot deal with that, and they really are better just on their own kicking it out. But if they can, I would suggest being there, because I think one of the things that's a big fear is that when they do this, they actually are going to like lose your affection. And you really don't want them thinking that way. We don't like what they're doing, but we love them, and we want them to know that that's the case. Now there's a chat, so I'm gonna okay, so hang on to the lying. It's about the lying question. So in terms of the tantrums, just remember that it is a phase. And it's a phase because the children don't yet often have the words to be telling you in advance. So it kind of escalates quicker than you might expect. Also, they don't have the self-control and the mental flexibility to be able to get themselves out of it. So what they really need is to feel safe and secure. So you just want to make sure whatever it is that works for your child, whether it's like safe and secure because I'm with you, or safe and secure because you're in your bed or your room and you're kicking it out, but you're not going to hurt yourself or someone else. That's really what they need at that point. And then we can try to work on, again, through stories and things like that, how can we avoid getting to that point? But part of it is also, I hate to say, but they have to kind of grow out of it. As they gain better skills, less likely they'll be able to get into it. I think as parents, we also learn what are the triggers for that particular child. Every child has different kinds of triggers that, and so you can start to see them and help them take those deep breaths and things that somebody else mentioned already. Now going back to Lee, the 3.25-year-old that starts experimenting with lying. So I'm guessing it's a pretty verbal child. And so some children, especially the high verbal ones, and I know we have at least one here whose child is speaking multiple languages, that also tends to be something that advances brain development faster. So children who are speaking multiple languages often hit this phase earlier as well. I don't think that was Lee's, but nonetheless, I'm guessing a pretty verbal child. And so yes, they're starting into that phase. And you're absolutely right. It says, we're not quite sure what to do. So far, we've just matter-of-factly said the truth and moved on. So first of all, let me distinguish like an actual lie from children don't understand. So a big one has to do with time. So children might say yesterday something or tomorrow something. They don't actually understand that yesterday is literally one day back. They sort of think of yesterday as the past and tomorrow as the future. And so sometimes it's not actually a lie, like yesterday I blah, blah, blah. They did in the past, probably. It just didn't happen to be yesterday. Or we had a little girl come in the other day and she said, oh, tomorrow I'm going to the dentist. And so the next day we said, so, after that next day, how was the dentist? And she's like, oh, I'm not going to the dentist until tomorrow. Well, again, to her, it's just future. Her parents had started talking about it. She really wasn't lying. So put aside things that they're saying it in a way that just isn't, they don't understand the words that they're using. But when they're actually lying, like telling you they didn't break the lamp or whatever has gotten broken, then I think it's important to say two things. One is, I don't know what happened because I wasn't there. So we're helping them get that idea of you kind of have to be there to know what happened. And so it's really important for me that you tell me the truth, because if you tell me the truth, then I know I can trust you, right? So getting that, like, yes, we know two different things. I need you to tell me the truth because truth is connected to trust. That's what's really important in terms of going forward. And Bridget answered, one thing helpful with her daughter was talking about the freedom and autonomy she might achieve if we can trust her. That's exactly right. It's like that next step. And Owen is 6 or something, right? She's about Lucia's age, I think. So she's ready for that next level, and that's great. Yep. Any other suggestions for this one? Okay. So the other thing I just wanted to mention on the tantrum issue is, tantrums just happen. It's part of being two, and you're okay. Like, it's okay. It's going to pass. Be very careful about rewards. And when I put the link into the Google folder, there's an article about the hazards of using rewards, because we actually want children to tell the truth because it's the right thing to do, or we want children, to just do what's the right thing to do. We don't want to have to reward everything. It actually turns out that if you use a lot of rewards, then when those are removed, children go the opposite way. There's actually a really fascinating study in a preschool where they started giving children treats for going to a particular center. So whatever center it was, I think it was an art center. They monitored how often children went to all the centers. The art center wasn't getting much use, so they started giving children treats if they went to the art center. And of course, going to the art center went way up. But when the treats stopped, going to the art center went down below where it had been to start with. So it sort of only lasts as long as the treats last. And so you kind of don't want to set up a situation where your child's whole life is waiting for an external reward. We want them to have that internal motivation to do the right thing simply because it's the right thing. So be quite cautious about that. There are cases where things are so dramatically not going well that we use a reward to sort of get things going in the right direction, but you don't want to continue it for very long. Okay, so there were a couple other things in the questions that really had to do with the pandemic specifically, and I'm calling them pandemic paradoxes because it's another one of these things where you want one thing and you want another thing, and they're sort of in direct opposition. So one person mentioned, and I think it might have come up already in our discussion, should I worry that my only child isn't getting enough peer socialization during the pandemic, right? So I want my child to socialize. I know peers are really, really important. At the same time, how do I help my child play independently so I can have a moment to myself, especially without too much screen time? And I gave some links at the beginning. We'll make sure that you get those. To some things that are non-screen time activities for children, but there also is some productive screen time. But again, this is a balance, right? I want socialization, but I also want my child to be independent. And both of those things are really, really good. In terms of the peer socialization, I'm not actually overly worried about children. We have some children who didn't come back to school. Their parents kept them at home this year for because of the risks. I'm not actually overly worried that those children, even the only children, will have a long-term problem. I think once they get back into a situation with peers, they're going to be just fine. In terms of language, as long as they're having adult conversation, their language is going to develop in a typical way. There are many people in the world where children don't have peers to play with, people live too far apart, or things like that. So I wouldn't worry about language development. I wouldn't even worry about social development, as long as when it's possible, you get them back into a social environment with their peers. And then in terms of how to help the child play independently, I would start with small things where the child is really naturally engaged and gradually lengthen. And Ariel actually has a wonderful strategy for this for her children in terms of their quiet time. They're sort of past napping, but she has lots of wonderful activities for them, but she also has gated space where they really can't come out. They're going to do it independently. And again, you don't start it with 2 hours. You start it small. They do little bits of time by themselves, and gradually that will lengthen. So I think part of it is just what you expect and letting children know what you expect and staying in that learning zone. So if your children can't do anything independently, start with 5 minutes. Start with something that is listening to a story if you don't want screen time. Ariel, you might even want to put into the chat that great story program that you have. I don't remember the name of it, but If you don't want screen time, this is something that they can just listen to on an iPhone or an iPad, something like that. Really engaging stories, but then they can play with their toys in their room, something like that. There also are some free podcasts that you can get for children that will help them. It's almost like they need their mind to be going, especially children that are highly social, right? It's a lot easier for the introverted children to have time alone. It's really hard for those children that just want to be talking constantly, but listening constantly can actually help them, because their mind is engaged in a conversation of sorts, and that can allow them to be more independent. Thanks, Ariel, for
here about using verbal praise.
Sure.
Does that count as a reward? And what about kids who love joking so much that they have trouble having a serious conversation?
Yep. So let's go to the verbal praise. Of course, we're going to, the child is walking for the first time. It would be really odd if we didn't like clap for them or praise them in some way. I think the most important thing to praise is the effort, is the progress. Be careful praising the outcome, because when we praise the outcome, then when there isn't such a good outcome, it's harder to know what to say. They're kind of always wanting to produce for us, and sometimes they can't. But the effort they can put in, or the improvement, those kinds of things are where you want to put your emphasis. And the like psychologists would call it, you want children to have a growth mindset. If we praise how smart or pretty or artistic they are, then that's praising a quality as if it's static. But what we want them to do is feel like they can grow, they can improve. So we want to praise the things that are changeable, that they have some control over, like effort and continuing to persist until they improve, those kinds of things. So try to emphasize things that will keep them growing, keep them on that edge of the learning zone. Because if children are praised too much for things that are what they perceive to be static, they'll never want to go out of their comfort zone because they always want to achieve well. And so it actually can retard their growth in that way. I don't think I have a growth mindset article in the Google Drive folder, but you can easily Google growth mindset and there will be some wonderful resources there. And then the issue of joking, I'm guessing that the joking has gotten them praise, right? So we want to be careful. Like if everybody laughs at their jokes and they're going to become a joker, that's how you get class clowns that you've probably all encountered in your life. So we want to be careful and also show them that we value their more serious conversations. And so sort of it's the catch them being good and reinforce, oh, I really enjoyed having that conversation with you, or whatever it is. So wait for the times that it happens, reinforce how enjoyable that was for you, and they'll want to do it more because they really do want to please us. It's basically what happens with young children. Okay, let me see. Was there another one, Ariel?
Yeah, there's one about a 2-year-old kind of pushing boundaries by, like going around and touching everything in the room and looking at you to see what you do.
Oh yeah, yep, because it's a way of getting attention, right? So I think that's where you can start to set those boundaries. I'm so glad that you're interested in these things. Let's look at this together and really think about sort of, first of all, why you have all those things out. If there really are a lot of things in a room that a child isn't allowed to touch, it's probably not that child safe of a room to begin with. So you might want to sort of think about why those things are there. Maybe they're very important to you, and then that's important to share with the child. Like, this is a precious thing to me, and so I have it here, so it reminds me, I don't know, whatever it is, it reminds me of my parents or something. And so help them understand that and why it's not something to touch. And maybe that if they would like to look at that, you'll look at it with them. Maybe you'll hold it so that they can touch it, those kind of things. Again, try to get them into that learning zone instead of the power struggle, push your buttons kind of zone. So it's, someone used the word validate earlier. It's validating stimulating their interest. Like, you want a curious child, but we have to be curious by looking with our eyes and not touching with our hands or listening with our ears. Tell them what they can do. Create a situation where you can say yes, instead of having too many situations where you have to say no. Because there again, remember, they're limited, number one, in how much they can remember, number two, in how much they can control themselves, and number three, in being flexible. They can't think of a way to distract themselves. When they start thinking about that thing that you don't want them to touch, it's really hard for them to switch their gears to something else. Sometimes you can just get it out of the way and it'll be out of mind.
They're
But
clarifying that
sometimes it's really
often
thinking
when
about,
they're
well,
not at home, when they're
oh, someone else's place.
that they can't just
Got
leave
it.
the-
Got it. Yep. So yeah, so you can't just take things away. And again, that might be a time when you say, so this is a time when I need to hold you because there are too many things, like, the child can't do it. It's not their fault that they can't do it. And so you need to create another situation for that child, which might be, I'll carry you for a while we go through this place that isn't good for you to touch. Like, again, it's sort of not the child's fault. You can't expect them at that age to be able to do that. And so what can you do to scaffold the child through that? Again, so it's not too much of a no environment. This happened actually a lot with the pandemic. So we had to try to figure out how to open school. And we purposely said to ourselves, we don't want to create a no environment. Don't touch that. Don't get too close to that person. Don't. And so we tried to actually change our environment in a way that made it more of a yes for the children. And we encourage the parents to do the same thing at home. So it might just be that that's an environment, either you can't stay very long or you have to hold the child or something like that, just to make it possible for the child to get through. Now I saw one that was about, 17-month-old constantly glued to you. And I'm sure the pandemic just exaggerated that. Prefers me over my husband and will often throw tantrums if I try to step away for any period of time. So follows you around, cries, etc. I know children are different, but my oldest demonstrated this only slightly, so I'm just at a loss how to ease her anxiety. So first of all, every child's going to be different. You're absolutely right. And I think instead of trying to get her to not want you, it's how can you help your husband to have things that she likes to do with him. It's like shifting that balance. And I have to tell you, it's not a fast process. We have this in our own family. And, fortunately, it's, in our case, it's kind of even who prefers who, but I think it's really about helping your husband, like, what are the things? So maybe it's like bath time is just his thing, or maybe it's that take some things that she really loves and anybody will do, and let him do more of that to the extent that it's possible. It also kind of depends on your schedules. I think also it may be hard to leave, but having, when pandemic permits, time for you to go have a walk or go have a bath or whatever it is, when it's just him. It's really hard to be the less preferred parent or grandparent, as the case may be, because it just can't feel good. And so you want to try to build it up, because it ends up to be reciprocal too. He doesn't feel good, so he's nervous. So it's, harder for him to interact with her. So I think that's something that you really have to work a little bit at a time on, building that relationship with him and what kinds of things can do. And Rebecca said, oh yes, there are so many more rules going out. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, the pandemic caused so many things. And actually my next slide, which is my last, is really the same thing. I heard a lot of people just expressing exhaustion over this year because of not being able to have other people caring for your children, whether it was that your daycare was closed, or normally you would be with other friends, or something like that. And then on the other hand, you have, but my in-laws or my parents are willing to take care of the children, but they're not willing to follow my guidelines. Right. So when you do have help, potentially, you're not really comfortable with that. Or maybe in this case, they weren't really following the safety rules that made you comfortable. So it'd be nice to have help, but if it's going to cause you more anxiety to have the help because of the guidelines, then that's a challenge. And it seemed like a lot of you were caught, or at least a lot of the people who answered the survey were sort of caught in that that situation where you couldn't necessarily count on the people who would help you, or you would generally feel comfortable because they weren't doing things the way that you felt needed to be done. And so that's where I think the most helpful solutions were when people could make some kind of team. Like I know Bridget's family and Ariel's family spent a lot of time together, but they had to do a lot of negotiating about how families were going to do things so that they could all feel comfortable with that situation. And speaking as the grandparent who has been given some of those guidelines, in a very nice, gentle way, I will say, for Ariel's benefit. No, my husband and I talked about the fact, and maybe you could talk to the parents if you're one of the people who put this question, about the long term. So we didn't agree with everything that we were asked to do, but what we decided was we want to have this relationship with this child and her partner and these grandchildren for a very long time. So we'll sacrifice, yes, we would probably give them more candy or, whatever it is. But that's okay, because we love them and we want to be with them. And most importantly, we want their parents to be comfortable leaving them with us. And we want their parents to have that space. Not that we've been able to do it much during the pandemic, because I also have to protect the children at my school, and my husband is a pastor, so he has to protect the people at church. So we haven't been able to do it a lot in the pandemic, but up until the pandemic, we really had worked hard on that relationship. And I think it's really just about honest communication, and trying to see if you can reach some common ground. And again, keep looking at those long-term kind of goals. Ariel, was there another question that came in?
No, I was typing some thoughts about the
Got it.
separation that were helpful for us. But
Yes, and also because you were a nanny in the past, right?
mm-hmm.
Yep. Well, so I am to the point, and I would be happy to take any questions. I know we were supposed to finish about 8 o'clock, but I'm happy to stay for a little bit. I'm also going to stop sharing so I can put a couple more links into the chat. Hang on just a second, but if there are other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to put a link to the Google folder that, and Ariel, you might want to copy this link. So let's try that. Yep. So this is a Google Drive folder, and this will stay available to you. It's open to anyone who has the link. So there's really no other protections on it. And what's in there, I'll just go over quickly. If you want to just click into the link, I'll try to link things to what I've been talking about. So the first one is about executive function, and it's a toolkit for helping you help your children develop that. Because someone had asked about helping children express their wants and needs when they don't have the language, there's an article about that. It's a great article about developing self-control in the ages 0 to 3, as well as a couple of other articles about self-regulation, particularly in young children or infants and toddlers. There's a spotlight on tantrums. We talked about that. There's that 6 reasons rewards don't work, and talks about the long-term consequences of using too many rewards. There's also the checklist. That's a developmental checklist for the person who asked about that. Also, there were some questions about children who start to speak negatively about themselves. I just had this happen. It's usually older children, but I just had it happen with a 5-year-old at my school. And so these are some resources that I found for those parents, especially children who are very sensitive to not being able to do something. And so they don't want to try. So the I can't do it, or I'm no good at this kind of thing. The key strategy here, I think, is to think about, I'm not good at this yet. I can't do this yet. The word yet really can flip it, because it reminds them that someday they will be able to. And if they just keep trying, it's that growth mindset idea that we talked about. And so those are the negative talk. Oh, and someone else asked about food. I don't know if that person is here, but there are a couple articles on children developing a positive relationship with food. And they also both talk about not using food as a reward. Like if you eat your dinner, then you can have dessert kind of thing. Or, if you do this X, Y, or Z that I want you to do, then you can have a cookie, because that can create a really negative cycle with food. And then a number of people were asking about sort of staying calm and how to not let your short fuse impact the situation. Someone mentioned it at the very beginning today. So there's a how to stay calm guide in there for parents. So, there are short articles. Maybe you read one a week and it takes you into the summer, or you just read the ones that seem relevant to you at this moment and keep track of them. Maybe Ariel can post the link as well. And then just because some people came in later, I had 2 links. One is to the children's school website. There are a lot of good resources, stories and music lessons and science lessons and things like that, could give you that the music lessons are about 20 minutes. They could give you that 20 minutes to have a cup of tea while your child is doing a music lesson, something like that. Yes. Oh, and the Google Doc book list, we could certainly add that. I've recently had a couple of families experience a death in the family, so I have a good list for grief books. Our school's also been working on issues that have to do with helping children to become anti-racist or becoming allies for people of different races. So I have a bunch of books about that, but that would be a great idea, Lee, to start a book list that people could add to. And then along the lines, particularly of things that have to do with inclusion, Ariel's father, my husband, is a Presbyterian pastor. And during the pandemic, he started reading books to children online. And on this YouTube channel, there are about 95 of them. You can see the titles very quickly. And at the beginning of them, he sort of talks about what the point of the book is. But there are a lot of good books there about treating others with kindness and things like that. So those are some really good resources for what you might be needing at this time. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any other questions. I know we've reached our time, but like I said, I'm happy to stay on a little bit if people don't have to go.
Someone's asking if you do any kind of parent coaching sessions, or if resources that are good for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first resource is the parents who've already been through it. I do a lot of parent coaching at my school because, of course, I have lots of parents who have questions, but I haven't ever done it like as a consultant type thing. But I think talking to the parents who've been through it and who you are in your circle is really a great place to start. If alternatively you need maybe a place where people don't know you, I'd be happy to talk to you about that, but you probably want to find someone in your community, just because it's nice. Like I live in Pittsburgh, but it is nice when it's not pandemic time to actually be able to be with someone. And sometimes the coaches actually work with you with your child, and that actually can be really effective. So you can see how that person works with your child. For example, when Ariel was young, we had friends who said to us, our child, we can't get him to sit down to a meal. He just gets up and walks around the house and wants to keep eating everywhere around the house. And I said, really? At my house, he sits in the high chair just fine. And, but they couldn't envision it until they came to our house for dinner. And they weren't the ones working with the child. I was the one working with the child, and they saw exactly how I did it with their child. So it's not the child, right? The child acted one way in my environment and one way at home. And they could see the strategies I was using. So your best coaches are going to be people who can actually work with your child, and you can sort of see them modeling and mentoring you along the way. But I can also talk to Ariel and see if there are some that are more in your particular area. Looks like oh yeah, the school versus home. It's so funny. We hear that all the time. Like we'll do a parent conference and talk about the child, and the parent is like, whose child are you talking about? Like, this is not my child, but it is actually their child in our environment. Okay, Sam is mentioning that there's some good resources at Hopewell and lots of trainings, so she'll continue to share those. And then Kathleen put a link in. Kathleen, do you want to talk about that link?
This is also at Hopewell, I think.
Oh, okay.
It's a virtual parent group.
Oh, great.
Been doing every
Oh,
week.
in fact, in the chat above it, she actually had the comment. I just hadn't scrolled that far up. That's great. Thank you. Great resources.
I think that there's also a group for grandparents. In tandem with
Especially
that,
grandparents who are raising children, right?
like grandparents who are caretakers for children or
Yeah.
who are babysitting them during the day or whatever.
Yep. Kathleen, I think I saw you unmute. Did you want to say something else?
Oh, I thought you were asking if you wanted me to share a little bit. Sorry, I'm in the middle of bath time, but
An amazing dual tasking you're doing.
yeah, if anyone is interested in joining us for the parent cafes, we still have a few spots open in the April one, and the May one is going to be the first 3 Tuesdays. They're all virtual and in the evenings. So it's just about parents talking to parents. It's not a class or anything.
That's great. Thank you. All right, well, we really appreciate everyone joining us. I'll hang out with Ariel in case there are any last questions, but make use of the resources and feel free to contact Ariel. She also knows how to get in touch with me if you have particular questions that maybe she thinks I can answer.